The Silver Knife River had transformed into a beast of churning brown water and splintered debris, devouring everything in its path through the Montana Territory Valley. 16-year-old Abigail Hale pressed her soaked dress against her shivering body, watching in horror as the deluge swept past their homestead with the violence of a runaway freight train. Noah! Her cry barely pierced the water's thunderous roar. Her 9-year-old brother clung desperately to a massive fallen pine, lodged against a pile of boulders, his small fingers white with cold, as the relentless flow tried to tear him away. Terror etched his young face lips, moving in silent prayers their mother had taught him. Without hesitation, Abigail gathered her skirts and stepped toward the raging torrent. The river had swollen 8 feet in mere minutes, swallowing the familiar stones where she'd washed laundry that very morning. Now those rocks lurked beneath the surface like waiting fangs, ready to crush anyone foolish enough to enter. Oh. Hold on, Noah, I'm coming. She took another step forward, gasping as the ice-cold water gripped her ankles with invisible talons, promising to drag her into the same deadly embrace that held her brother captive. Strong hands seized her shoulders, halting her mid-stride. She whirled to face a tall Lakota warrior she'd noticed camping upstream with his people. He was lean and weathered, with graying braids and battle scars marking his left cheek. His penetrating gaze held hers with an intensity that froze her protests. "Stop," he said in accented but clear English, his voice cutting through the river's violence. "Rope first." "He's dying." Abigail struggled against his iron grip, but his hands remained steady as granite. "Let me go." The warrior, she remembered hearing someone call him Tasunke, shook his head once. With his left hand still restraining her, he reached behind his back and pulled out a coiled rawhide rope. His movements were swift and deliberate, each motion born from years of trusting his life to such preparations. "Now you go in like that," he said, nodding toward the murderous flow. "You both die." Behind him, 2 young Lakota men sat their nervous horses, Shyla and Kanji, she recalled. They controlled their mounts with practiced skill, despite the animals' terror at the flood's fury. Tasunke tied one end of the rope around his chest, just under his arms, testing each knot, with the care of someone who understood that details meant survival. He secured the other end around a thick cottonwood root jutting from the bank, checking the anchor twice before trusting it with their lives. "When I signal," he called to the young men, "pull hard." Noah's cry drifted across the water, weaker now. His grip on the pine was failing small hands, losing their battle against the relentless surge. Without another word, Tasunke dove into the chaos. The water seized him instantly, spinning him downstream until the rope snapped taut. Abigail held her breath as his head vanished beneath the churning surface, then emerged 20 feet from where he'd entered. He swam with powerful strokes, fighting the river's attempt to carry him past Noah's precarious refuge. A shattered wagon wheel spun past his head, missing him by inches. He ducked beneath it and continued swimming, his braids streaming behind him like black serpents. The rope stretched between him and the bank, a lifeline that groaned under the strain of his battle against the relentless flow. When he reached the fallen pine, Noah was barely conscious, lips blue with hypothermia. Tasunke hauled himself onto the trunk, water cascading from his buckskins as he spoke to the boy with gentle urgency. "I have you, little one. Hold tight to me." He drew his knife and began cutting at the branches that had trapped Noah's legs beneath the surface. The blade flashed as he worked, sawing through wood, while bracing himself against the tree with his free arm. Each cut had to be precise. One mistake would send them both into the river's hungry maw. A grinding rumble echoed from upstream, and Abigail's heart stopped. More water was approaching, a second wall of destruction that would sweep away anything still in the river's path. "Hurry!" she screamed. Tasunke heard it too. He abandoned careful cutting and grabbed Noah under the arms, lifting him free through sheer strength. The boy cried out as his trapped leg came loose, but he was free, alive, breathing. Tasunke raised his right arm, high the signal. On the bank, Shyla and Kanji spurred their horses backward. The rope burned through their hands as they pulled, the animals' muscles straining against the river's grip on the two figures in the water. Their hooves dug deep furrows in the muddy ground as they fought to drag their human cargo to safety. Debris battered them as they were hauled through the turbulence. A chicken coop exploded against a boulder just feet away, sending wooden splinters flying like arrows. The bloated carcass of a pig rolled past them, grotesque in death. 20 feet from shore, Shyla's horse slipped on the wet grass. The animal went down hard, and the young warrior rolled clear just as Kangi leaped from his own mount to grab the rope. Blood streamed from his hands where the rawhide had cut deep, but he held on as his horse backed away from the water's edge. Abigail waded in waist deep to help drag them to safety. The frigid water knocked the breath from her lungs, but she grabbed Noah's arm and pulled him toward solid ground. Tasunke followed, stumbling as his feet found purchase on the rocky bottom. They collapsed on the muddy shore just as the second surge crashed over the spot where Noah had been trapped. The ancient pine snapped like kindling and vanished into the maelstrom, gone as if it had never existed. Noah was alive, coughing up river water and crying for his mother. Tasunke knelt beside him, checking his pulse and examining his scraped leg with practiced hands. The warrior's own body shook from cold and exhaustion, his breathing ragged from his fight with the murderous flow. Abigail pulled off her soaked coat and draped it over Tasunke's shoulders. It offered little warmth, but it was all she had. "You could have died," she said, her voice barely steady. Tasunke looked at Noah, then at her. His weathered face held no regret, only the quiet certainty of a man who'd made the only choice his conscience would allow. "He would have," he said simply. 5 days before the catastrophe that would reshape their world, life in the Silver Knife River Valley had followed the familiar rhythms of frontier existence. Though tensions simmered beneath the surface, like water building behind a dam, Abigail stood in her family's log cabin, watching her mother Margaret stir oatmeal over their iron-cooked stove. At 45, Margaret still carried herself with the dignity of the schoolteacher she'd been before. Frontier life wore her down, but her shoulders bore the permanent weight of recent losses and daily hardships. The cabin felt different since Silas Thorne had moved in. Her stepfather's presence filled every corner with an uncomfortable authority that made simple conversations feel like negotiations. He'd married Margaret just 4 months after Thomas Hale's death in a logging accident, bringing his mine foreman's wages and an assumption of control over their water rights that rankled Abigail's independent spirit. "Water pressure's been low again," Abigail mentioned casually as she set the table for breakfast. "The well that Father dug seems to be running slower since the mine expanded its operations upstream." Silas looked up from his coffee, his pale blue eyes fixing on her with the calculating attention of a man who weighed every word for potential threat. "Wells run low in dry seasons, girl. That's nature, not mining. But it's been running lower every week since you moved those steam engines closer to our property line." Abigail persisted, though she kept her tone respectful. "Maybe the mine's diverting more groundwater than... maybe." Silas interrupted, his voice carrying the edge of a man unaccustomed to being questioned. "You should worry less about mining operations you don't understand, and more about helping your mother with household duties you do understand." Margaret's stirring slowed her shoulders, tensing at the tone her new husband used with her daughter. But she said nothing, having learned that challenging Silas's authority often made situations worse rather than better. 9-year-old Noah sat by the window, whittling a piece of pine into the shape of a horse. His brown eyes, so like their father's, reflected a gentleness that worried Abigail. Since Thomas's death, the boy had grown increasingly quiet, spending hours carving tiny animals that he arranged on his windowsill like a miniature menagerie. "The mine has rights to water use, established by territorial law." Silas continued cutting his bacon with precise strokes that somehow managed to sound threatening. "Rights that take precedence over individual complaints. The sooner everyone in this valley understands that, the fewer problems we'll all have." There was something in his tone, not just authority, but ownership, that made Abigail's stomach tighten. He wasn't just talking about water rights. He was talking about power, about who controlled what in their small corner of the territory. "Of course," she said quietly, but her mind was already working. If the mine was taking more water than legally allowed, that was information worth documenting. Her father had taught her to keep careful records of their well's output, and those records might prove useful someday. Later that morning, Abigail and Noah rode to Blue Rock for their weekly trip to town. The journey took them along the river road where the Silverknife ran clear and shallow in its normal channel. Above them, the Silver Spur mine clung to the mountainside like a man-made eagle's nest, its wooden buildings connected by walkways and rope bridges. The steady thump, thump, thump of the stamp mill echoed across the valley, crushing ore to extract silver with mechanical precision. But today, there seemed to be more activity than usual. Extra wagons moved up and down the mountain road, carrying equipment that looked different from the usual mining gear. When Abigail shaded her eyes and looked more carefully, she could see men working around what appeared to be the splash dam, the water control structure that the mine used for floating logs downstream. "They're doing something up there," Noah observed, following her gaze. "Lots of men with shovels, and are those barrels?" They were indeed barrels, and something about the way the workers handled them carefully with obvious respect for their contents suggested they contained something more dangerous than water or grain. As they watched, a familiar figure emerged from the mine office and began gesturing authoritatively at the workers. Even at this distance, Silas Thorne's commanding presence was unmistakable, his pale hair catching the morning sunlight as he directed operations with the precision of a military commander. "Why would they need so many barrels at the dam?" Noah asked innocently. "I don't know," Abigail replied, but she had a growing suspicion that whatever was happening at the Silver Spur mine, it wasn't routine maintenance. Their ride took them past a small Lakota camp on the river's north bank. 12 people traveled together with pack horses and travois men, women, and children moving between reservation lands and traditional hunting grounds. Such groups weren't uncommon, though tensions had been rising lately as conflicts increased throughout the territory. As they passed, a small incident occurred that would prove more significant than either Abigail or Noah realized at the time. Noah's wooden horse, his latest carving, slipped from his hands and tumbled into the road near the Lakota camp. Before Abigail could dismount to retrieve it, a tall warrior with graying braids and scars on his left cheek walked over and picked up the small toy. He examined it carefully, turning it over in his weathered hands, with the appreciation of someone who understood craftsmanship. "You made this?" he asked Noah in accented but clear English, his voice carrying genuine interest rather than condescension. Noah nodded shyly, his usual reticence around strangers warring with pride in his work. "It is well made," the warrior said seriously, handing the horse back with the respect due to a fellow artisan. "The proportions are correct, the grain of the wood respected. Your father taught you." My father's dead," Noah said simply, without self-pity, but with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who'd learned early that life brought loss as well as joy. The warrior's expression softened with understanding. "Then you carry his teaching forward. That is good. It means he is not truly gone." During this exchange, Abigail found herself studying the man's face, reading the character written in the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. There was strength there, certainly, but also kindness and a deep sadness that spoke of his own losses. When his gaze met hers, she saw not the dangerous savage that some townspeople feared, but a man who understood both the weight of responsibility and the price of survival. "I am Tasunke," he said, including both of them in his introduction. "We travel south to winter grounds, but stop here to trade and rest." "I'm Abigail Hale," she replied, surprised by her own boldness in speaking to a strange Indian man. "This is my brother Noah." Tasunke nodded gravely to both of them, then gestured toward the mine, visible on the mountainside. Much activity up there lately? More than usual for this season. It was a casual observation. But something in his tone suggested he'd been watching the mine's operations with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to notice when patterns changed in potentially dangerous ways. "Do you think something's wrong?" Abigail asked, though she wasn't sure why she felt comfortable asking such a question of someone she'd just met. Tasunke was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands adjusting something that hung beneath his shirt, something small and precious, judging by the careful way he handled it. "In my experience," he said finally, "when powerful men begin moving in secret, it usually means trouble for those with less power." Blue rock had grown around the mine's prosperity, but today, the town felt different, more tense, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen without quite knowing what. What began as a trading post had sprouted a saloon, hotel, blacksmith shop, and enough houses to call itself a proper town. The main street remained unpaved, but wooden sidewalks fronted the businesses, and there was talk of bringing in a circuit judge to establish regular court sessions. Beatrice Collins taught school from a converted warehouse behind Paulson's general store. At 32, she was unmarried by choice, fierce about education in a way that made some miners uncomfortable. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore dresses designed to survive chalk dust and the chaos of teaching 15 children of various ages in a single room. "Perfect timing, Abigail," Beatrice called as they approached. "I was calculating expenses for new primers." She counted out 18 cents for the eggs, then made a precise notation in her ledger. Everything Beatrice did was recorded somewhere: attendance, expenses, taxes, owed community needs. She kept better records than most businesses in town. But today, something seemed different about the schoolteacher's usual efficiency. As Beatrice wrote in her ledger, Abigail noticed several official-looking envelopes partially hidden beneath other papers on her desk. The envelopes bore territorial seals and were addressed in formal script that suggested government correspondence. More intriguingly, Beatrice seemed to be writing more than just a simple transaction record. Her pen moved quickly across the page, documenting not just the purchase of eggs, but additional observations. Mine activity increased. Unusual equipment transport. Community water pressure reported low by multiple families. When Beatrice caught Abigail watching, she quickly moved other papers to cover her writing. But not before Abigail glimpsed what looked like a formal letter, beginning with "Dear Governor Potts" in Beatrice's precise handwriting. "The mine still hasn't paid their school taxes," Beatrice said, her voice carrying an odd note of satisfaction. $47 overdue, and it's been 3 months. Some people might consider that a pattern of avoiding territorial obligations. "Maybe Silas can help," Abigail suggested, though doubt colored her voice. "Perhaps," Beatrice replied, but her slight smile suggested she had other plans for dealing with the mine's delinquent payments. "How's your mother's arm healing?" Margaret had suffered a bad burn 2 weeks earlier, one that had become infected despite careful tending. The injury left her weak and unable to perform her usual farm work. "Slowly," Abigail admitted. "She tires easily and the infection keeps coming back. I'll prepare some willow bark tea for the pain," Beatrice offered, but then she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Abigail, I want you to know that if your family ever needs help, any kind of help, there are people in this territory who take their obligations to citizens seriously. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Abigail wasn't entirely sure, but she nodded anyway. There seemed to be currents running beneath the surface of ordinary conversations lately, as if everyone was speaking in code about things they couldn't discuss openly. At Paulson's general store, the undercurrents became more obvious. Abigail hoped to buy nails for repairing their chicken coop, but Henry Paulson's usual friendliness was replaced by uncomfortable formality. "No nails today," he said when Abigail made her request, not meeting her gaze. "Your family's account is closed." "Closed?" Heat flooded Abigail's cheeks. "We don't owe you anything." "Mine debts." Paulson said, his jaw set in stubborn lines. Silas Thorne's orders. No credit to his family until the mine settles accounts. This was news to Abigail. She'd never heard mention of any debt, and Silas certainly hadn't discussed it with the family. But Paulson's discomfort suggested he was following orders he didn't entirely agree with. What kind of debt? She pressed. We've always paid our bills. Not your debt, girl. Your stepfather's family debt. Seems there's been some question about irregularities in mine accounts. Until that gets sorted out, no credit for anyone connected to mine management. Outside the store, Beatrice waited with her ledger open, having overheard the conversation through the thin walls. I'll document this, she said, her pen scratching across the page with unusual vigor. If the mine is using fabricated debts to control families, territorial authorities need to know. She paused, then added meaningfully, yes, some authorities are already very interested in the mine's financial practices. The ride home took them past the Lakota camp again, where Abigail noticed increased activity. The travelers were breaking camp with the efficient haste of people who'd read weather signs or received other warnings about staying in one place too long. But 3 figures remained behind Tasunke, and 2 younger men she'd heard called Shyla and Kanji. They were securing equipment and moving horses to higher ground, preparing to weather whatever was coming rather than flee from it. As they passed, Tasunke looked up and caught her eye. He nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both greeting and warning. Then he returned to his work, but Abigail noticed him glancing frequently toward the mine on the mountainside, as if keeping watch for something specific. That evening brought the first clear indication that their world was about to change forever. Silas Thorne came home later than usual, his clothes dusty and his manner tense with barely suppressed excitement. Over supper, his conversation revealed more than he probably intended. Big day tomorrow, he announced, cutting his venison with sharp, precise strokes. Been planning it for months. Everything has to go exactly right, or... He paused, seeming to remember his audience. Well, let's just say there are opportunities coming up that don't present themselves often. What kind of opportunities? Margaret asked innocently. Silas's pale eyes glittered with anticipation. The kind that reshape entire valleys, my dear. The kind that separate those with vision from those too small-minded to see the bigger picture. As he spoke, Abigail noticed him unconsciously touching a small silver locket that hung from his watch chain, a delicate piece of Native American jewelry that seemed completely out of character for a mine foreman to own. Will there be any danger? Margaret pressed her maternal instincts, picking up on something ominous in her husband's tone. There's always danger when powerful forces are unleashed, Silas replied with what might have been philosophy or threat. The key is making sure you're on the side that controls those forces instead of being controlled by them. After supper, Abigail walked outside to check their livestock and think about the day's strange conversations. From their cabin's position on the rise overlooking the river, she could see the mine clearly, and tonight it was busier than she'd ever observed. Lanterns moved along the walkways like fireflies, and the sound of heavy equipment being moved echoed across the valley. More importantly, she could see activity around the splash dam. Even in the growing darkness, torches illuminated men working with obvious urgency around the water control structure. They moved with the focused intensity of people working to a deadline, and whatever they were doing involved those mysterious barrels she'd noticed earlier. As she watched, a disturbing pattern emerged. The workers weren't maintaining the dam, they were modifying it, placing the barrels at strategic points along the structure in what looked suspiciously like preparation for a controlled demolition. A chill ran down Abigail's spine as she realized what she might be witnessing. If someone was planning to destroy the splash dam, the resulting flood would devastate everything downstream, including their homestead, the Lakota camp, and half the farms in the valley. But why would anyone want to cause such destruction, and what did Silas mean by opportunities that would reshape entire valleys? The answer, when it came, would prove more sinister than she could have imagined. Later that evening, she encountered Hans Keller coming down the mountain path with his toolbox and an expression of barely controlled fear. The mine's millwright was normally a confident man, but tonight he looked like someone who'd seen his own death in the near future. "Miss Hale," he said, touching his cap but glancing nervously back toward the mine. "Terrible business up there. Terrible business." "What do you mean, Mr. Keller?" Hans looked around as if checking for eavesdroppers, then stepped closer. "I was ordered to inspect the splash dam supports today. Write up a report on their condition. And the timbers are rotten from all this summer rain, Miss Hale. Weakened to the point where a strong wind might bring the whole structure down. I told Mr. Thorne it needed immediate repairs or it could fail catastrophically." Hans paused, his hands trembling as he gripped his toolbox. But that's not the worst part. When I gave him my report recommending emergency repairs and immediate evacuation of downstream areas, he read it carefully. Then he smiled the coldest smile I've ever seen on a human face. What did he do with the report? Threw it straight into the fire. Told me to mind my own business and stop trying to cost the company money with unnecessary repairs. Hans's voice dropped to a whisper. But that's not what frightened me most, Miss Hale. What frightened me was what he said next. Which was, he said, "Don't worry about the dam, Hans. Nature has a way of taking care of problems like that." Then he laughed, not like a man who was worried about structural failure, but like a man who was looking forward to it. Abigail felt ice forming in her stomach. "You think he's planning to let it fail on purpose?" "I think he's planning worse than that," Hans replied grimly. "I saw Morrison and his men moving barrels of blasting powder up there tonight. Enough to level half the mountain if they wanted to." "But why would they want to flood the valley?" Hans shook his head. "I don't know, Miss Hale. I just know that I kept a copy of my report hidden where Thorne can't find it. And I taught my apprentice Tommy how to recognize the signs of structural damage, so there'll be more than one witness to what that dam looked like before it failed." After Hans continued down the path, Abigail stood in her yard, trying to process what she'd learned. If Silas and Morrison were planning to destroy the splash dam deliberately, they had to have a reason that justified the massive destruction and loss of life that would result. The most obvious motive would be insurance money. But that didn't explain Silas's comment about reshaping the valley, or his obvious excitement about upcoming opportunities. Then she remembered something from her father's stories about territorial politics. Land that had been flooded and abandoned often became available for purchase at government auctions, sometimes for pennies on the dollar. And if someone with inside knowledge knew when and where such auctions would be held, the pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Silas wasn't just planning to destroy the dam, he was planning to use the resulting flood to drive people from their land, then buy up the damaged property at fire sale prices. It was a scheme that required advanced knowledge, careful timing, and complete ruthlessness about the human cost. But there was still one element missing from her understanding. Why had he married her mother? A mine foreman's salary would be sufficient to purchase flood-damaged land without needing to marry into a homesteading family, unless their particular piece of land had some special value she didn't understand. Something that made it worth the trouble of a marriage of convenience to ensure legal ownership. As she puzzled over this question, movement from the Lakota camp caught her attention. A figure had detached itself from the group and was walking toward the river Tasunke, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in darkness. When he reached the water's edge, he knelt and placed something small in the stream. Even from her distant vantage point, Abigail could see it was the same silver ring he'd been examining when they first encountered his group. The ring disappeared into the dark water, carried away by the gentle current. But Tasunke remained kneeling by the river for a long time, his head bowed in what looked like prayer or farewell. Something about the scene filled Abigail with profound sadness, though she couldn't say exactly why. There was a finality to the gesture, as if Tasunke was saying goodbye to something precious that he knew he would never see again. The morning of the fourth day dawned gray and threatening, with storm clouds heavy enough to taste. Abigail woke to distant thunder rolling across the mountains and dressed quickly to help with breakfast. She found Margaret moving slowly, favoring her injured arm, while Silas paced the cabin with barely contained energy. "Perfect weather for what we have planned," he announced to no one in particular, his pale eyes bright with anticipation. "Couldn't have asked for better conditions." "What are you planning?" Margaret asked innocently. Silas caught himself before revealing too much. "Mind business, my dear. Nothing that concerns the household." But his excitement was palpable. And when Jake Morrison arrived at their door just after sunrise, the two men's conversation left little doubt that something significant was about to happen. "Everything ready, brother?" Morrison asked, using the familiar term that Abigail had heard before but never really noticed. "Don't call me that where people can hear." Silas replied sharply, glancing toward the cabin. "But yes, everything's in position. We just need the storm to provide cover, and then we'll own this whole valley." Morrison finished with satisfaction. "Been a long time coming, but it'll be worth the wait." The word brother echoed in Abigail's mind as she went about her morning chores. She'd always assumed Morrison was simply being familiar, but combined with their similar builds, pale eyes, and commanding mannerisms, it suggested a much more significant connection. If Silas and Morrison were actually brothers, that explained the mine foreman's complete trust in his security chief. It also suggested that whatever they were planning involved family business rather than just corporate interests. Noah was at his usual window post, watching the activity across the valley. The Lakota camp was almost completely broken down now, with most of the travelers having moved south during the night. But Tasunke and his two young companions remained, their horses saddled and their gear packed, as if ready for immediate departure. "They look like they're expecting trouble," Noah observed with the clarity that children sometimes brought to adult situations. "Maybe they are," Abigail replied, remembering Tasunke's warning about powerful men moving in secret. The first fat raindrops began falling around mid-morning. By noon, the storm had settled over the valley, like a heavy blanket with lightning splitting the sky and thunder rattling the cabin windows. The river, running low from the dry summer, began rising as mountain runoff poured down through countless gullies and streams. Silas had left before the storm hit, riding up to the mine with Morrison and a group of heavily armed men. Their departure had the feel of a military operation, with equipment checks, synchronized timing, and the grim determination of people about to undertake something dangerous. The first explosion came at 2 in the afternoon. It was different from thunder, sharper, more focused, with an echo that seemed to originate from a specific direction rather than rolling across the sky. Abigail was hanging laundry under their covered porch when the sound made her freeze with a wet sheet clutched in her hands. "What was that?" Noah called from inside. Before she could answer, a second explosion followed, then a third. Each seemed to come from upstream in the direction of the mine. But these weren't the controlled blasts used for normal mining operations. These were bigger, more violent, coming in rapid succession like a string of firecrackers. "Those came from the dam," Margaret said, appearing in the doorway with her face drained of color. "God help us, they're blasting the dam." And then the flood came, with all the fury and destruction that Abigail had feared sweeping away their world and setting in motion the events that would test every relationship, every assumption, and every hope they had ever held dear. In the aftermath of the rescue, as Noah shivered in Tasunke's arms and the immediate crisis passed, Abigail realized that the flood had been only the beginning. The real test would come in the hours and days that followed, as the survivors tried to piece together not just their lives, but the truth about what had happened and why. The morning after Noah's rescue brought visitors that confirmed Abigail's worst fears about the conspiracy behind the flood. 8 men on horseback approached their makeshift camp led by Sheriff Walter Briggs and including 6 of Silas Thorne's mine guards. But something about Briggs seemed different today. More alert, more carefully observant, as if he was seeing the scene with fresh eyes, rather than simply following a predetermined script. Jake Morrison, riding beside the sheriff, carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. His pale eyes swept the flood-damaged landscape with satisfaction rather than sympathy. And when they fixed on Tasunke, they gleamed with anticipation. "Well, well," Morrison called out as they reined in their horses. "Look what we have here. Indians at the scene of the crime, just like Mr. Thorne predicted they'd be." Morrison's voice carried the same commanding tone that Abigail had heard from Silas. And now that she was looking for family resemblance, she could see it clearly in their builds, their mannerisms, and their shared assumption of authority. But Sheriff Briggs was studying the scene with unusual attention to detail. His eyes taking in the rope burns on Tasunke's hands, Noah's obvious state of recovery, and the clear evidence of a rescue rather than sabotage. "Now hold on, Morrison," Briggs said, pulling out a small notebook and beginning to write. "Let's get all the facts before we start making accusations. Miss Hale, can you tell me exactly what happened here?" As Abigail described the flood, Tasunke's rescue of Noah, and the timing of the explosions, she noticed Briggs writing down her words with unusual care. Most local sheriffs she'd encountered were casual about record-keeping, but Briggs documented every detail as if building a legal case. "That's very interesting," Briggs said when she finished, his pen still moving across the paper. "Very detailed testimony. I'll make sure this gets into the official record." Morrison was growing visibly agitated by the sheriff's thoroughness. "We don't need a full investigation, Briggs. We know what happened here. Indians sabotaged the dam, then played hero to cover their tracks." "Do we know that?" Briggs asked, mildly, still writing. "Because what I'm hearing sounds more like a rescue than sabotage. And I'm curious about those explosions the girl mentioned. They happened before the flood, not after." This was clearly not the conversation Morrison had expected to have. His face darkened with frustration, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of threat. "Sheriff, I think you're forgetting who pays your salary in this county. Mr. Thorne wants these Indians arrested, and that's what we're going to do." But instead of backing down, Briggs looked up from his notebook with an expression of mild curiosity. "Actually, Morrison, I think you're forgetting who I really work for. And it's not Silas Thorne." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Morrison's confident expression wavered, replaced by uncertainty and the beginning of genuine alarm. "What's that supposed to mean?" Morrison demanded. "It means," Briggs said calmly, "that some of us have been keeping very careful records of everything that's happened in this valley over the past 6 months. Every suspicious death, every unexplained raid, every piece of missing native jewelry that's turned up in certain people's possession." As if summoned by the tension, Beatrice Collins emerged from the ruins of a nearby homestead, where she'd been helping injured survivors. But instead of her usual schoolteacher's ledger, she carried an official-looking leather satchel that seemed far too formal for someone of her supposed station. "Sheriff Briggs," she called out clearly, her voice carrying across the flood-damaged landscape. "I have those documents you requested." Morrison spun toward her with wild eyes. "What documents? What's going on here?" Beatrice opened her satchel and pulled out several official papers bearing territorial seals. Correspondence from Governor Benjamin Potts, authorizing a comprehensive investigation into systematic violence against native trading parties and irregularities in mining operations. She held up one of the documents for everyone to see. "I've been documenting violations of territorial law and reporting them to the governor's office for the past 6 months. This valley has been under federal observation longer than you might think." The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. The quiet schoolteacher who kept meticulous records had been a government informant all along, documenting his crimes and reporting them to territorial authorities. But Morrison wasn't finished fighting. As his world began to collapse around him, he did what cornered animals do. He lashed out with desperate violence. In one swift motion, he drew his gun and pointed it, not at the adults who threatened him, but at Noah, who was still recovering from his ordeal and represented the most vulnerable target available. "Everyone back away," Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I don't know what kind of trap this is, but I'm not going down without a fight." The sight of her brother threatened with death sent ice through Abigail's veins. Noah's brown eyes were wide with fear, but she could see him trying to be brave despite his terror. "Please," she begged, stepping forward with her hands raised. "He's just a child. He has nothing to do with any of this." "He has everything to do with it," Morrison snarled. "This whole family has been nothing but trouble since Silas married into it. Maybe it's time to solve that problem permanently." But Morrison was panicking now, making the kind of mistakes that came from desperation rather than planning. The ground beneath his feet was still treacherous with mud and debris from the flood, and his attention was divided between multiple threats. Sheriff Briggs began moving slowly to one side, his hand resting casually on his gun, but not yet drawing it. The federal deputies he'd mentioned were nowhere to be seen, but his confidence suggested they were closer than Morrison realized. "Let's talk about this, Morrison," Briggs said calmly. "You're surrounded, but you don't have to hurt the boy. We can work something out." "Work something out?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "With people who've been lying to me for months, I don't think so, Sheriff." That's when Tasunke made his presence known, stepping out from behind an overturned wagon where he'd been tending to Kanji's injuries. His movements were deliberate and non-threatening, but there was something in his posture that commanded attention. "Morrison," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite its soft tone. "That ring on your hand belonged to my wife. She was wearing it when your men killed her at Dry Fork Creek 6 months ago." Morrison's face went through several expressions: surprise, calculation, then defiant anger. "Prove it, savage." But the accusation had done more than challenge Morrison's version of events. It had focused everyone's attention on the silver sunburst ring that gleamed on his finger, a ring that clearly didn't belong to a mine security chief from Montana Territory. "Where did you get that ring?" Sheriff Briggs asked, his notebook still open and ready to record Morrison's answer. "Found it," Morrison replied automatically, then caught himself. "I mean, it was reported as stolen property, evidence." But the damage was done. His story was already falling apart under scrutiny, and everyone present could see the guilt written on his face. Tasunke took another step forward, his weathered hands empty but ready. "She never took that ring off. It was her grandmother's, passed down through 4 generations. The only way you could have gotten it was by taking it from her dead body." Morrison's gun swung toward Tasunke, and for a moment, violence seemed inevitable. But before he could fire, the treacherous mud beneath his feet betrayed him. His boot slipped on a patch of slick clay, throwing off his balance and sending his shot wide. In that instant of confusion, several things happened at once. Noah, showing his father's quick thinking, threw himself sideways and rolled away from Morrison's grip. Deputy Pike, who had been working his way around the confrontation's perimeter, fired a carefully aimed shot that struck Morrison in the shoulder and spun him away from the boy. But Morrison's reflexive shot, triggered by Pike's bullet, ricocheted off a piece of flood debris and struck Kanji in the leg as the young Lakota warrior tried to reach safety. The wound was serious, but not fatal, and the sight of blood flowing from the innocent young man seemed to galvanize everyone present. Tasunke was on Morrison in seconds, his knife at the wounded man's throat. But instead of finishing what the confrontation had started, he looked up at Abigail with eyes that held a question. "He killed my wife," Tasunke said quietly, his blade drawing a thin line of blood where it pressed against Morrison's neck. "Justice says he should die." Morrison, pinned and bleeding, looked up at the faces surrounding him with the desperate eyes of a man who'd finally run out of options. "But Mercy," Abigail said softly, meeting Tasunke's gaze, "says he should live to face proper justice. Let the territorial court decide his fate." Tasunke held her gaze for a long moment, then slowly lifted his knife away from Morrison's throat. "Then, Mercy it is," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested healing as much as resignation. But even as Morrison was arrested and the immediate violence ended, one crucial question remained. Where was Silas Thorne, and what had happened to the man who'd orchestrated the entire conspiracy? The answer came with a column of smoke rising from the direction of the mine, not the controlled emissions of normal operations, but the black, billowing smoke of a major fire consuming everything in its path. In the days that followed Morrison's arrest, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge through the painstaking work of federal investigators and the testimony of witnesses who had finally found the courage to speak the truth. Hans Keller proved to be a crucial witness, his engineering expertise and documented warnings about the dam's condition, providing irrefutable evidence that the flood had been deliberately caused. More importantly, his hidden copies of safety reports established a clear timeline of negligence and deliberate endangerment. I knew something terrible was going to happen. Hans testified to the federal investigators. But I never imagined anyone would be evil enough to cause it on purpose. Deputy Pike, now revealed as an honest lawman who'd been documenting corruption for months, provided detailed accounts of the bribes, threats, and illegal activities he'd witnessed while maintaining his cover as a loyal deputy. "I wanted to act sooner," he admitted to Abigail during one of their conversations. "But I needed enough evidence to make charges stick in territorial court. Too many criminals have walked free because honest people moved too quickly and didn't build strong enough cases." Sheriff Briggs's undercover work proved to have been even more extensive than anyone realized. His notebooks contained detailed records of conversations, transactions, and criminal activities spanning nearly a year of investigation. "Morrison and Thorne thought they owned me," Briggs explained to the gathered survivors. "They got careless, said things they never would have said to a federal agent. Sometimes the best way to catch criminals is to let them think they've corrupted you." But the most heartbreaking testimony came from the families of Morrison's victims, native traders who had been murdered for their horses, jewelry, and goods during a systematic campaign of violence that had masqueraded as random raids. Tasunke's identification of his wife's ring proved to be just the beginning. Morrison's personal effects included jewelry from dozens of other victims, creating a catalog of grief that stretched across the territory. They weren't just stealing property, one federal investigator explained. They were systematically eliminating native trading parties to drive up the value of their own goods and create fear that would justify military intervention. The trial, when it finally took place, lasted only 3 days. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and Morrison's guilt so clear that even his expensive lawyers couldn't mount an effective defense. He was sentenced to life in territorial prison, a fate that some considered too merciful given the scope of his crimes. But as Tasunke had said, mercy was sometimes more powerful than vengeance. Silas Thorne's fate remained a mystery until searchers finally found his remains in the burned ruins of the mine office. Whether he died accidentally or chosen to end his life rather than face justice, they would never know. But his death marked the end of the criminal enterprise that had terrorized the Silver Knife River Valley. The legal resolution was satisfying, but the practical work of rebuilding proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. The flood had destroyed not just buildings and farms, but the economic foundation that had supported the valley's communities. With the mine closed, pending federal investigation, hundreds of workers found themselves unemployed and facing an uncertain future. Some families packed up and left seeking opportunities in other territories. But many chose to stay and try to build something better from the ruins of what they'd lost. That's where the federal government's unprecedented offer came into play. Rather than selling Thorne's seized assets to another mining company, territorial authorities proposed transferring ownership to a community cooperative that would give local residents control over their own economic future. It's never been tried before, Marshall Crawford admitted during the first community meeting. But then again, this valley has already proven that unprecedented cooperation is possible. The negotiations that followed were neither quick nor easy. Some homesteaders initially resisted sharing resources with native families, while some Lakota elders questioned whether they could trust agreements with whites after so many promises had been broken. The most contentious issue proved to be water rights, with upstream farmers worried that downstream native fishing grounds would limit their irrigation options during dry seasons. This is exactly the kind of thinking that got us into trouble in the first place, Abigail found herself saying during one particularly heated community meeting. We're fighting over dividing what we have, instead of working together to increase what's available to everyone. She stood before the assembled residents, her role as the cooperative secretary, giving her both the authority and the responsibility to mediate such disputes. Tasunke's people have been managing water resources in this valley for generations, she continued. Maybe instead of seeing their knowledge as a threat to our farming, we should see it as an opportunity to farm more efficiently. The solution, when it finally emerged, came from Hans Keller's engineering expertise combined with traditional native water management practices. They designed a rotation system that provided adequate irrigation for crops while maintaining the natural flow patterns that sustained fish populations. It wasn't perfect, and it required compromise from everyone involved, but it worked, and more importantly, it established a precedent for future cooperation. Kanji's injury slowed to heal, and leaving him with a permanent limp served as a constant reminder that their victory had come at a cost. The young warrior's courage during the final confrontation had saved lives, but the price he'd paid weighed heavily on everyone involved. Yet Kanji himself seemed to bear no resentment about his sacrifice. Every victory requires someone to pay a price, he told Abigail during one of his visits to the cooperative's headquarters. I'm honored that my injury helped bring justice to this valley. His words carried the wisdom of someone who understood that individual suffering could serve larger purposes, and his example helped heal the divisions that might otherwise have torn the community apart. A year after the flood, as summer returned to the Silver Knife River Valley, the community gathered for its first annual celebration of survival and cooperation. The festivities were held on the anniversary of the flood, not to celebrate the disaster, but to commemorate what they had built from its aftermath. Families from a dozen different backgrounds, white homesteaders, German immigrants, Lakota families, former miners, came together to share food, music, and stories. The event was both celebration and memorial, honoring those who had been lost while celebrating those who had survived. Noah, now 10 and considerably more confident, demonstrated his wood carving skills to a group of admiring children. His latest creation was an intricate model of the community's new bridge, complete with tiny figures representing all the different people who used it. Each piece has to fit exactly right, he explained to his audience with the seriousness of a master craftsman. If even one part is wrong, the whole thing falls apart. It was a lesson that applied to more than woodworking, and the adults listening understood the deeper meaning of his words. Margaret and Sheriff Pike announced their expectation of a child news that was greeted with community-wide celebration. The baby would be the first born into the cooperative, a symbol of the future they were all working to create. Hans Keller presented his latest innovation, a water-powered generator that could provide electricity to community buildings. It was a small thing compared to the massive changes they'd weathered, but it represented the kind of technological progress that became possible when people worked together instead of against each other. Beatrice Collins read letters from territorial officials praising the community's success and asking for advice on establishing similar cooperatives in other troubled regions. The recognition was gratifying, but more important was the knowledge that their experiment in cooperation was spreading beyond their own valley. But perhaps the most significant moment came when the community formally dedicated a small memorial to those who had died in Morrison's raids, including Ayanna and the other native traders who had been murdered for their possessions. Tasunke spoke at the dedication, his words carrying the weight of personal loss transformed into community purpose. "We cannot bring back those who were taken from us," he said, his weathered face reflecting both grief and hope. "But we can make sure their deaths meant something by building a world where such violence is no longer possible." As the celebration continued into the evening, Abigail found herself standing with Tasunke on the bluff overlooking the river, watching their neighbors dance to a mixture of fiddle music and traditional native drums. In the years since the flood, their relationship had deepened from desperate alliance to genuine partnership. They worked together daily on cooperative business, their different perspectives and skills complementing each other in ways that strengthened both their individual efforts and their shared goals. "Do you ever regret choosing mercy over vengeance?" she asked quietly, remembering the moment when he'd held Morrison's life in his hands. Tasunke was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on the wooden railing Hans had built for the overlook. "Sometimes," he admitted. "When I think of Ayanna, when I see Kangi struggling with his injury. But then I look at what we've built here and I know we made the right choice." He gestured toward the celebration below, where children of different backgrounds played together while their parents shared food and stories. "If I had killed Morrison, it would have been justice for the past. Letting him live was an investment in the future." Abigail reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a silver ring, simple but beautifully crafted by the community's metalworker. The design incorporated both traditional native motifs and pioneer symbols representing the blending of cultures that had become possible in their valley. "Speaking of the future," she said, her cheeks warming with embarrassment and hope. Tasunke looked at the ring, then at her face, reading the question in her eyes, with the skill of someone who'd learned to communicate across cultural boundaries. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" he said gently. "I'm asking if you think two people from very different worlds can build something good together," she replied. "If you think love is strong enough to bridge the gaps that history and prejudice have created." Tasunke took the ring from her palm, studying it in the firelight from the celebration below. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but more important was what it represented: a commitment to building bridges instead of walls. "I think," he said carefully, "that the best things in life come from taking chances on hope instead of surrendering to fear." He slipped the ring onto his finger, then took her hands in his weathered ones. "I also think that some partnerships are worth any risk, any challenge, any sacrifice required to make them work." It wasn't quite a traditional proposal, but it was a promise of something deeper, a commitment to build their life together, stone by stone, challenge by challenge, day by day. As fireworks began exploding overhead, Hans Keller's contribution to the celebration, carefully planned and safely executed according to the community's new safety protocols. Abigail and Tasunke stood together, watching the lights reflect off the peaceful waters of the Silver Knife River. The valley had been forever changed by flood and fire, by violence and loss. But from the ashes of destruction, they had built something unprecedented, a community where different peoples could work together, where justice and mercy could coexist, where the future held more promise than the past held pain. It wasn't perfect, no human institution ever was, but it was good, and it was theirs, and it was worth everything they had sacrificed to create it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as it always did, but they would face them together, secure in the knowledge that they had proven what was possible when good people refused to surrender to evil. The flood had taken much from them, but in the end, it had given them something even more valuable: the knowledge that when people chose cooperation over conflict, justice over expedience, and love over fear, they could overcome any obstacle and build a future worth living. Standing there with her hand in Tasunke's, surrounded by the sounds of celebration and the sight of genuine community cooperation, Abigail felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing they had built something that would last. Not just the buildings and the businesses, but the relationships and the principles that would guide future generations. The celebration continued late into the night, but eventually, the music faded and the fireworks ended. One by one, families gathered their children and headed home to houses built with community labor, funded by shared profits and protected by laws they had all helped to write. As the last of the celebrants made their way down the hill, Abigail and Tasunke remained on the bluff, reluctant to end a perfect evening. The river murmured peacefully below them, carrying no debris now except the occasional leaf or twig, natural things that belonged in the water's flow. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Abigail asked, her fingers intertwined with his. "About rope first." Tasunke smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "I remember thinking that you were very brave, but also very foolish. Courage without preparation is just another way of dying young. And now I think you've learned the difference between bravery and recklessness. You still have all the courage, but you've gained the wisdom to use it well." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of their valley owls calling from the forest, the distant lowing of cattle, the gentle murmur of the river that had once threatened to destroy everything and had ended up bringing them all together. "Rope first," Abigail said softly, and they both understood that she was talking about more than rescue techniques. She was talking about preparation community, the bonds of trust and cooperation that made dangerous undertakings possible. Hand in hand, they walked down the hill toward the home. They would share the community they had helped to build and the future they would create together. Behind them, the Silver Knife River flowed peacefully toward tomorrow, carrying their hopes and dreams downstream to whatever adventures awaited beyond the valley's protective embrace. The flood had been the end of one world and the beginning of another. They had chosen to make the new world better than the old one, and in doing so, they had proven that sometimes the most devastating disasters could become the foundations for the most beautiful triumphs.